In this video, we're going to be breaking down one of the most powerful, although misunderstood compositions in the game, the poke/spam composition. Now, this composition can allow you to slowly whittle down the enemy team's resources, getting picks, and slowly but surely consuming the enemy team and winning the game. Now, if you enjoyed this content, do me a solid and smash that like and subscribe, but let's jump into the video. Now, the first thing that we need to talk about is what is a poke composition. This is a composition centering around long distance spam, whittling down the enemy's resources, not taking the fight to them, but looking for advantage in the form of attrition of resources from range or looking for potential picks, and it's typically classified by large amounts of damage output or high amounts of burst damage that can be from range. Now, before we break down how to play it and how to win with it, because you're going to win a lot with this comp if you master it, let's talk about what characters build up what is a poke/spam comp. First off, the tanks, which doesn't have a lot of flexibility compared to some of the other compositions we covered. We have Sigma and Ramatra as the far and away best two options for a composition like this, both capable of doing damage from range, helping their team, zoning away off angling DPS, and building up that incremental advantage from a distance. And while Ramatra has Nemesis form, he can primarily use it defensively if they're diving in, or defensively if the brawl actually makes close range contact, or if you get a whole bunch of picks and you close in the fight, but we'll talk about that concept later. Other tanks that you can play is Orisa, technically from range. She was better pre-nerf, but you could still play her from distance, typically just spamming and creating a lot of pressure from the front line, using her cooldowns to stop brawls or stop dives. And then Diva could technically be played as well, but as a more peel-centric, really passive form of Diva that is just looking to keep her team alive, protect her team, and defend from the enemy team's plays and spam. Now, the next role that we got to talk about is the supporting role, and the best three supports that can be played in a poke composition is Zen, long distance spam. You could put Discord on the enemy tank or any other character that you think you can get an opportunity to pick. Zen adds a ton of damage pressure himself and can get pickoffs himself with volleys, so being able to constantly get an advantage in a poke war if you're playing the mirror, or just create so much extra damage and pick oriented pressure, Zen is like the creme de la creme for this composition. Mercy is fantastic as well because damage boost is phenomenal on a lot of DPS that want to spam output damage or potentially get picks. Plus, because you're playing so far away, if anyone on your team dies, reses are typically very free and you're going to get a lot of them, so that's why Mercy plays really well. Baptiste, the amp matrix is just really good. It's like one of the few compositions you can really take advantage of amp matrix because your team is playing back, spamming. Amp matrix can be a really great way that you can actually play a little bit more proactive and really just heavily burst down the enemy's resources. And then as far as other supports are concerned, you could definitely get away with playing characters like Kiriko and Anna, specifically just trying to look for damage, look for picks, oftentimes playing with their team, spamming out damage and trying to add to that shield break, damage, resource, attrition, pressure. But these are a little bit worse than some of the other options. And I would say this is a composition that the characters that are not included here, Brig, Moira, Lucio, are pretty much like, do not play them in this comp because they just won't be able to do anything. Your team is playing far away, trying to whittle down the enemy's resources and look for picks. What is a Lucio going to be doing there? You can't really do anything. Your speed boost is useless, and you're just going to be like AFK, and if you're flying around the map trying to get picks, it would be a super huge anti-synergy with a composition like this. Next up, let's talk about the DPS. And for DPS, you want several things. You want a DPS that can do a ton of damage from range, or you want a DPS that has the potential to get key pickoffs. The reason that you can have characters that do key pickoffs in a composition like this is because they can heavily apply pressure to the enemy's positioning. As your team starts to whittle down the enemy resources, gaps in the enemy positioning will be created and your DPS could get pickoffs. So snipers are fantastic. Hanzo and Widow. Hanzo being one that provides a ton of damage and provides pickoff potential. Characters like Junkrat, Torb, and Ashe can all output a ton of static pressure just existing behind the Sigma or behind whatever your primary tank is. And you can also play DPS on off angles applying pressure. They're not necessarily going in and trying to clean up a ton of kills or anything like that. They're just poking from distance, applying that pressure, and then of course once you get that advantage, you will close in the gap, which we'll talk about in a second. And that means that you could still play DPS like Echo, Sojourn even, but you're not flying in and diving in like you would in a dive composition. You are instead just poking with your team, trying to find picks or meaningful advantage, and then eventually you're trying to either build up an ultimate to make a better play or actually close in once you have already established that advantage. Speaking of which, you might be wondering, how can I play this composition? If it's so strong, how do I play it right? And what are the big mistakes that I could be making that will prevent me from winning with this composition? Now, the first thing that you need to understand is distance. This comp is all about distance. You never want to be on top of the enemy when they have resources or the same amount of people as you. Well, you don't have to be all stacked on top of each other like a traditional brawl or anything like that. Your DPS can definitely take off angles. No one wants to be close to the enemy. Everyone wants to have that distance because you're trying to find an advantage from distance, constantly poking in your team's effective range and away from the enemy team. If the enemy team is playing a brawl, hypothetically, they want to close in the gap on you, and you never want to allow them to do so because your team is more suited to play at distance and their team is more suited to play close range. So what does that mean? Every time they push forward, you back up, you give space, whittling them down in the process. Because the entire time, as long as you maintain that distance, you and your team will be building up more ultimates, generating more advantage, getting more picks, and just being the more effective comp. And that is the strength of this comp. Because as long as you maintain that distance, you will win the neutral. And that means that you'll just win unless the opponents pull out something. They're proactive in a way, and it puts the burden of play on them. The opponents have to do something in order to shut down your comp, or they're just going to slowly lose, and there's nothing they can do about it. So then they're forced to do a play. But if they do that play poorly, if they don't brawl correctly, there's tons of gaps and openings that you can just take advantage of just by existing, which is why this comp is so powerful for ranked play. Now, next up, let's talk about when you actually close in. Like, you can't just poke away forever. You do want to close in at some point, even though you're a long distance comp. You want to close in after you've gotten that advantage. Whether that means everyone on the enemy team is super, super low, or you've gotten some picks, or, you know, you killed their tank, or whatever the case may be, then you can close in. You can close it out much more akin to a brawl comp. You want to be a little bit careful here because if they have like a heavy brawl comp with some brawl characters like a freaking Mei and a Reaper, you got to be really, really careful. You want our attrition down more than normal. But basically, the idea is you poke, you attrition, you create that advantage, then you close in the gap after the fact, and then you go back to your static playstyle in the next fight. Don't just go close in and then play brawl from then on out, because remember, your strength is playing at a distance. Now, the next thing that you need to understand is how does each part play? How can each part carry, and what is each role supposed to do? So the tank is supposed to give space in the enemy team, like I said, backing up and pushing forward, but still keeping a huge gap of distance between you and the team. They're trying to generate ultimate and apply pressure to the enemy. Whether that means applying pressure to the enemy tank so that tank can't just W key and set up an optimal engagement onto you and your team, or applying pressure to the enemy DPS so that it's easier for your DPS to look for an advantage, or just generating ultimate and just creating a lot of damage-based pressure. That's kind of what a tank is doing. So you're creating space while giving it, while not dying, and looking for that opportunity and helping your team create that. DPS are looking to either one, off angle and try to look for a pickoff or create that advantage, or two, spam consistent amounts of pressure that when coupled with the other pressure created from your team can generate picks. So like imagine a Sigma spamming somebody at the same time there's a Discord on them, at the same time a Junkrat spamming them. You can get random picks out of nowhere with a lot of damage-based pressure, and that's incredibly powerful. So the enemy has to respond to a lot of this damage, and sometimes there's more damage than they can respond to, and sometimes that movement will allow some of your other DPS, like characters like Widow, to find free picks, and as the enemy team is moving around, there's going to be more opportunities for that Widow to give value. As far as supports are concerned, you're trying to either one, enable the picks from your DPS, or you're trying to spam yourself. Enabling would be like damage boosting on Mercy. Trying to find the picks yourself would be like discording, calling it, spamming volleys, looking for that opportunity on Zen. But let's actually talk, most importantly, about the composition's weakness. Like, how do you lose to a brawl? How do you lose to a dive? And how do you beat these comps? So with a brawl wants to close in the gap. Like, they're going to try to speed into you. And they might not be able to speed into your off-angling DPS, but they'll speed, like, on the Sigma. They'll speed on the supports. They'll speed on the tank. And then the Reinhardt will beat you to death, and the Mei will slowly freeze you, and you'll cry, and it's gonna suck, right? So how do you beat it? Like, what can you do to stop this? So the first thing that you need to understand is that you need to keep your distance at all possible, and you need to be prepared for dramatic movement. So cooldowns like a Reinhardt's charge, or like a Lucio's speed boost, these you have to be pretty careful of, and you have to err on the side of caution when the opponents are full health, full cooldowns, because they could pivot out of nowhere. The second thing that you need to do is conserve your cooldowns. And this is also true versus dive. Basically, what you're doing here is you're not throwing your rock out of nowhere. You're not wasting your lamp just randomly when you're playing with your team. You're not using your movement abilities as DPS already. What you're doing is you're conserving all those things. Because realize, if you're up against a dive, if you're up against a brawl, as long as you maintain that distance, which is your effective range and not theirs, your team is more efficient in the neutral game, meaning that you're going to find more damage, more picks, more opportunity than the enemy team, and it's on the enemy team. The burden is on them to change their circumstance. The burden is on them to dive. The burden is on them to get close and brawl, because if they don't do these things and just play in the mid or play in the neutral, they will lose. So that means that you don't need to waste your cooldowns when you have an advantage. You want to conserve your cooldowns so that the moment the brawl speeds into you or the Ryan charges into you, you have rock to hit him with, or nade to nade spam him with, or immortality field. Same thing with dive. You have all these cooldowns because you're in a strong position. You can conserve your cooldown so that when the opponents try to make it to their strong position, their strong engage, you have your cooldowns to defend yourself. And then you basically use your cooldowns to weather the storm. They have to back up, and now you're back into your strong position again. And that's the cycle. So the game is you have to make sure that you have enough cooldowns to deny the enemy brawl or dives engages. And if you waste your cooldowns for no reason, and then they engage onto you, that's how you lose with a poke composition. Now, as far as how to play poke in ranked, I think it's actually a pretty simple composition to play, assuming that your tank is playing a poke tank and not trying to actively brawl the enemy team. All you have to do is play DPS or supports that line up with that. Try to have that synergy or create that synergy with your teammates so that you're not playing like a random Lucio Brig or a freaking random Genji with a Sigma, which is like characters that just don't line up in any way and don't work towards the same type of composition. And really think about what composition the enemy team is running, or if they're playing like an amalgamation, what's the closest like adjacent thing that they're running. And that's going to dictate how you have to play with your cooldowns, how passive or reserved you are. And it's really going to allow you to leverage this to a lot of wins. But definitely let me know if you have any questions down below. And do me a huge solid and check me out on stream. Smash that follow button down below in the description. Thank you so much for coming by, and I'll see you next time.